Hello and welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I'm happy to present to you today this session on what you want to know when you want to know it. Today we're going to be looking at designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solution as part of the AZ-305 Architect course. In this module, we're going to be taking a look at logging and monitoring-based solutions. This is an important part of any deployment. Gone are the days where you set and forget, do something once, walk away and figuring you've got it done. You want to make sure that you're constantly monitoring your solution and adapting and making changes along the way. So we're going to take a look at what is a thing called Azure Monitor. And it's not just a way to monitor the resources inside of Azure. The marketing term that we love to talk about is it's the single pane of glass. And I come from a rich history using products like Configuration Manager as part of this System Center Configuration Manager tool that you're working with in the System Center suite of products. But monitoring is such a huge part of making sure that the environment that you've built is still healthy and maintained in that initial configuration. And you've got to make sure that you're not moving away or what's called drift, because as soon as you deploy something, it starts to drift away from that initial configuration. So what is operational conditions within constraints that you've defined? And the only way you can tell that is through monitoring. And so we'll take a look at Azure Monitor as this single pane of glass, because now it can monitor your entire Azure deployments regardless of where they are in the world, but you can now extend it to be that single pane of glass. It can take over those on-premises monitoring tools that you've maybe had, mentioned System Center Configuration Manager. I can now extract all of that information and bring it into Azure Monitor. I can even manage other cloud services and bring them into this single pane of glass and have a single vision of all of that data and how my application and my environment is being maintained across these various environments to make sure that we've got a condition that is acceptable for the business to take a look at. We'll take a look at this thing called log analytics as a central place to gather all that information and now be able to take that volume of information and to chunk it up into pieces that you want. This is a thing called log analytics, and you'll create a thing called a workbook. And I can have multiple workbooks that of this total volume of data. Maybe you got some stuff for production versus test. Pretty simple division. Maybe I got stuff that is split off by a type of application. So it's a single set of that data that you can now query and run reports on and make decisions around through this log analytics component and working with these things called workbooks in this higher layer of working with it. We have a thing called Azure Insights that you can now provide some intelligence against that volume of data. Now, we've got other tools as well, and you take a look at the hierarchy of, we've got a free tool called Azure Advisor that can be run against that information and make recommendations on 5 very specific areas of security and cost and operational excellence, and give you some recommendations that you might want to do to your environment. You can have custom features that you're going to monitor for and then trigger values. We have things, all the way up to Azure Sentinel as a way to be able to do this and be more proactive in it. We, have all these different tools that can look at this data, but the starting point would to get it into a log analytics environment. We're going to then take a look at some of the tools we have to look at this information, and we'll look specifically at a thing called Azure Data Explorer to take a look at that information other than through the natural interface. So let's get into that lesson. A large part of my career at Microsoft was dealing with a product called Configuration Manager, or SCCM. And so this is a near and dear to my heart topic. Building something, absolutely, you got to get it right. But how do you know you've built the right thing unless you're going to go through and monitor and track the usage of it? The way you built it initially might not be the way it's being used over a period of time. And so adaptations and changes to that might have to take place. So monitoring of any deployment is absolutely critical to make sure that it was done correctly in the initial get-go, as well as that it's going to maintain that performance and expectation over a period of time. So monitoring a huge, huge part of what we think is a successful deployment. It's just not like you set it and forget it and leave. So what we're going to take a look at is Azure Monitor as a tool is built into the heart of Azure. And literally everything is monitored because we need that information. We've talked about data centers and what they are and how a data center rolls up into a region. Well, a data center, we've got millions of computers and millions of switches and kilometers of wiring that all needs to be managed. And so we have all that information. We know that a virtual machine that you have running on our infrastructure is running. We have no visibility on what's going on inside of it. That's secure information. Microsoft, we talk about it, we run on trust, because you wouldn't trust us very much if we were looking at what's going on in your virtual machines. But we know that you have a VM running on some hardware, because what happens if that hardware has a problem? No problem of yours, but because of our problem, your VM might not be running anymore. So we have to be able to take remediation actions to be able to now give you back that VM in a state that you could use that activity. So absolutely, Azure Monitor is monitoring everything that's going on to Azure, and we make that information available to you. So in your architectural designs, it's important to bake in all of these features. I'm going to spend just a minute or two on the slide here and just talk about some of these separations that we have. Starting from the bottom, we have a whole set of custom sources. And what that's for is you do not want to have a wide variety of monitoring solutions that you have to go through. I don't want to have to go to my on-premises monitoring tool to monitor my on-premises stuff. If you have other cloud providers, you don't want to have to go to their monitoring tool to monitor their stuff. And you don't have to come to Azure Monitor to monitor our stuff. Azure Monitor, as like a lot of these other products, have the capability to monitor the totality of your space that you want to have monitored. So those custom sources, we could take all of your on-premises information, we can move it into Azure Monitor. So through a thing, our term is, we talk about a single pane of glass. So in a single pane of glass, you can get all of your monitoring services in one pane of glass. You can bring in information from other cloud providers. So those custom resource or sources are available for you. So moving up from custom sources, we are now going to take a look at all of the monitoring capabilities inside of Azure itself. You absolutely have access to all of your tenant information. This is where you're going to be able to get information about billing constructs that you have, your consumption and usage of resources. And this is where you're going to start to pull off, and we talked about the scope in management groups and subscriptions down to resource groups. So the tenant level information that you have, you may not want everybody to have the totality of it, but we have it at the tenant level. And just because we talked about governance way back in another module, that's probably why you also don't want to have multiple tenants, because this information comes at the tenant level. And if I had 5 or 6 tenants, I would have to export that information and import it into a common tenant that you're working with. Or I guess I could connect my one tenant to get this information through those custom services and bring it into this tenant yourself. We then have billing information at the subscription level. This is where you're going to get into some of the cost controls and the numbers that are coming back in. We then get into the Azure resources. So this is at this level, you're going to be able to see that you have a virtual machine running that has 4 cores that are 40% busy. That's the kind of level you're going to get at the Azure resource level. If you have an app service plan that's running a web app, you're going to be able to see some input, output values for TCP traffic that you're looking at. So fairly high level at the service level itself. It's at this point that basically Microsoft drops out of the picture. We have access to, as I said, we know that you're running a VM, and we know that it's running Windows Server 2012 or 2019, but anything else beyond that, we don't know. So from this perspective upwards, this is where you exclusively have access to this information. I'm going to show you an example in just a minute where I'm going to go into my operating system, and you're going to see that there's a whole set of metric information and log information that comes from inside of the virtual machine. We know a virtual machine is running, but you need to maybe get the information out of the virtual machine. And further up that stack, you're going to have this thing called Application Insights. And we're going to show you how to set up an Application Insights account to get information about the applications that might be running on infrastructure. For example, you have a web app and it's running in an app service plan that you're going to be able to get information about the app service plan from the resource utilization. And you're going to be able to sit there and see the traffic in and out, but you want to be able to see how many clicks happen on this feature of the web app versus another feature of the web app. That's going to come from this thing called Application Insights. So these become the scopes in which we get information. Now, moving to the right, we're going to take a look at the types of information that are available to you. And this is where I want to just go off to a whiteboard for a second. Actually, I'm going to go to an actual tool, and I'm going to show you examples of what logs and metrics are. This is the volume of information that you have to pick from. Now, my experience has been that what customers typically do is one of two things. They don't collect any of it, or they collect everything. And neither one of those is the right answer. Because if there is a condition that you want to be able to go in and maybe figure out what happened, if you don't have that information captured, you're not going to be able to have all the forensic information that you need. So you want to make sure that you're collecting this information so that at the point in time, you can go back and look at this information. Also, another note, it's not in the slides. By default, Microsoft makes this information available for you for 90 days. That's the default. So you'll see when I go to the demonstration, I'll go back a number of days, and anything after 90 days is not available to you in the Azure monitoring tool. This is where we're going to show you some other capabilities where you can export this information and have it for longer periods of time. And it would be my strong recommendation that you take a look at doing this for longer than the default period in Microsoft. Just as an example why, the average time between breach of a system and detection of that breach is over 200 days. So if you can only go back 90 days, yes, you'll know that you were breached 90 days ago, but you're not going to figure out where did the breach take place. So you really want to make sure that you're looking at a broader scope, and you don't want to collect everything because that's like looking at the sun. You just got so much information there. How do I pick out the bits that I need? And I said, I'm going to do a demonstration of that in just a second. So metrics and logs are the types of information we want to take a look at. And so I'm going to do a demonstration just right now that will show you some of the differences between them. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing up Computer Monitor from my local computer in here. I'm not showing any secret information. I'm going to zoom in to make this a little bit easier for you to see. What you're looking at is a tool called Computer Management, and this is running on every computer. So my example of a VM running in Azure, this is a set of the information that you could only get that if you ask it to be admitted to Azure Monitor, we can collect on your behalf. So what I've done is I've got two pieces in here. I've got Windows logs, and I have what are called metrics down here under Performance Monitor. So taking a look at logs, logs are point-in-time activities that have been flagged by whoever wrote the log system. In my case, this would have been done by Microsoft with regards to, I'm looking at the security logs. But if you have applications, you could write logs, whoever the application writer is says, hey, if this application happens, if my banking app that has loan applications, and if the loan throws an error, I want to log that information. That's up to you to log that information. So you're seeing a variety of logs that are listed here, and some are marked as warnings and some are secure information. And so you can have this whole set. I'm going to scroll down and take a look at the audit failure. And down here, you have volumes of information. And that's what the benefit of a log is. At this point of time, this activity took place, and I want to gather all the information that I think that I need to know about that activity. And so you're going to see some information about the event ID and the date and the time that took place, some information about if there's an ID that's involved, and you can get all this detailed information about that point in time in which that activity took place. Now, that's significantly different than these performance monitors that I want to take a look at. These are called metrics. Metrics are near real-time emitting of information. It's going to talk about temperature. Maybe your CPU. What is the spindle speed of your hard drives? Like everything is being monitored. It's amazing what kind of metrics are out there. Now, a metric by itself really doesn't tell you anything. The temperature is 85 degrees. I need to know something else at that time that might indicate, because 85 degrees, if I'm on a beach on a sandy place in a warm tropic environment, it's probably a good area to have another beverage. But if it's the core temperature of my body, I'm about to die because I'm in hypothermic shock. So metrics by themselves only give you a small part of the picture. But I want to just show you how complex some of these metrics can be. So I'm going to come in and take a look at what are called counters. And so in the counters here, I'm going to take a look at hard disks. And so we have a physical hard disk. So if I scroll down here, and you can see for the physical hard disk, I have all these different counters. There's % disk read time, % disk write time, % disk time. Now, I'm thinking percent disk read time, percent disk write time, percent disk idle time. That should probably equal the percent disk time, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. You're also going to see across all the objects that I can get these counters. And this is where I say people go, I don't know what I need. Give me everything. And so they add all of those counters. So I'm now going to take every single counter, and there's hundreds of them that are now going to be emitting in near real time information about my physical drive. Now, if I had a 1 terabyte disk drive, and I had split that 1 terabyte drive into 2 logical disks, I had a 50 gig C drive and a 500 gig C drive and a 500 gig D drive. The physical drive is 1 terabyte, and it shows 50% full. Now, when I look at the logical drives, I've got a C drive at 500 gig and a D drive at 500 gig. The C drive might be 100% busy, making up half of the entire drive itself. And so what I'm showing you here is if I come back up, not only do I have physical disks, I'm going to have to come up in here and look at a thing called logical disks. And so logical disks have exactly the same counters, but this is done at the logical disk level. So if I've had partitions, so if you don't know, you say, give me all those counters. And so now what I'm doing is, I'm just going to zoom out because you don't care about this too much. I'm getting in near real time the emitting of all this information, both at the physical and logical level. And I'm going to collect all that information and which ones do I need to really look at. So just a brief look at the different types of information that are available for us at the different levels of, in this case, I was showing you at the operating system level. Know that some of this stuff is also happening at the Azure levels itself. So all of that appears in metrics and logs. And then on the far right-hand side, there's 5 levels that we want to take a look at. Great that you've got this information. If you never look at it or have to look at it, well, maybe that's a good thing. But what we want to be able to do is to get some insights. That's that top box. We want to be able to take this information and say, hey, it's 85 degrees. What does that mean? I want to get some insight. Does it show usage? It's 85% busy. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Is it above normal or below normal? So you typically also want to have what are called baselines that you can measure against to see over time, am I changing things? Are they staying static? Do I have to maybe re-provision or provide more resources so that I can meet the growing demand that we have for this? Moving down the stack, we take a look at visualizations. We can make this information available. I go into data centers now and at companies, and I feel like I'm walking into a sports bar because they have all these monitors that are up that are showing all of the traffic and the conditions that their mail servers are running at, and so they get all this information. So I can take that telemetry information, I can make it available in reports, I can publish it to websites, I can put PDFs that get mailed to people. So there's a whole wide variety of ways to visualize and make this information consumable to the people who need to look at the information. We're going to show you that we have ways to analyze the information, because with that volume of information coming in, maybe you don't want people there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year monitoring that. I want to be able to provide some analytical information to be able to do analysis against that. We may use machine learning to do that analysis against that information. Then I want to have a response. You can automate a lot of the responses that you can predict that would happen and go through a set of things called alerts and actions so that if this takes place, and if you remember or if you've taken the scale set unit of this course, we talked about being able to dynamically expand and contract resources. And we've done that in other places for app service plans, dynamically expanding and contracting based on workload. Well, that is a response basically from a metric that said based on a time of day or a metric, CPU utilization, we need to expand or contract the resources to that. So that would be a response. And then we get to integrate that with other systems. We've talked in other units about things called logic apps, which is a series of business processes that you can have. I've got some things that if it flags a system, it goes out to a product called Remedy, generates a service ticket, takes that service ticket, contacts the vendor to indicate that that service has failed and we need maybe a replacement part for it. So you can provide these integrations to your ticketing systems possibly, or any other third-party systems to be able to complete a full business practice. Now, this slide is giving you basically what I was talking about before, taking a look at the types of information and some access methods that you have to it. So basically, we took a look at the Azure tenant information. We can see that Microsoft Enter ID, we can get a whole bunch of information about the user accounts. When did people log in? We've talked about it in other modules about being able to have event grids and event hubs, being able to take that information and queue it up and then respond to things based on that. So we have resource management as well as identity management that all generate this information. We saw that at the subscription level that we have information. And specifically, this is where I was kind of doing my example. At the operating system level, it's up to you to export that information so that it can be imported into Azure itself or into the Azure monitoring solution. So these ones down here at the bottom, those are going right into Monitor. By default, it's up to you to export these other things into Azure Monitor so that they can be collected and looked at in that single pane of glass. Today, I'm going to be talking about Azure architectures and specifically looking at designing for log analytics. Let's get into this. In previous units, we've talked about the types of information that are available to you. And now we want to take a look and focus on what do I do with the information that I have it. Log analytics is your ability to take this volume of information, regardless of where it comes from, and being able to take that information into a single repository and perform some actions against it. You'll hear the term called Kusto query language, which is the language that you can write these complex queries around. The nice thing is we also have some visual tools that will allow you to do some of this, so you don't have to actually program it. You can drag and drop and then use filters to go in and pick down the objects you're working with. And I'll actually do that in a demonstration at the end. But log analytics, as I said, is a service as part of the Azure Monitor that helps you actually collect and analyze this data. When we take a look at some of the components that make this up, Log Analytics, you create a thing called a workspace. Within the Log Analytics tool itself, you generate a workspace that you can then collect the information from a variety of sources. You can collect the kind of information. We talked previously about things, whether it's metrics or logs. So I get to pick what kind of information, where I want to get it from. Now, it doesn't move it. That data lives with whatever those objects are and the place where it's originally stored. But now what I'm doing is I'm creating a storage repository to collect this information from all of these different areas to say, listen, I just need to know CPU utilization. I don't care about all the other counters about your CPU. I just give me that feature from that server or those group of servers. So your workspace is going to provide this common location of some predefined information that you've pulled in. And they're talking about different ways that you can set this up, whether it's centralized, where you bring into a common workspace all the information, and then people can come in and selectively pick out the stuff that they want, or do you decentralize it? And now what you have is multiple people going to have to be able to go off and pull this information. Now, there's lots of pros and cons of doing it one way or another. Having it in one single place, you get volumes of data, but you have less storage because you're going to have one source of truth. If you have decentralized models, maybe you've got it decentralized and people are picking stuff up in North America versus Europe. That's great because maybe GDPR rules doesn't want that information moved outside of the data domicile requirements that you have. So there's reasons to have one versus that other, but by decentralizing it, you run the risk of having duplications of some of that data because you needed it and I needed it. So instead of having it in a central place, it's across both. And that's where that last one comes in. And that's what a lot of people will do is have some kind of hybrid model where I'm going to be able to sit there and say, here's some common information that's across the organization. I will be responsible for gathering and collecting that where, maybe for regulations, we're going to be able to keep your data in your location and my data in my location to meet those specific requirements. Once I gather the information, we want to be able to control access to it. And so the workspace, and you're seeing, is that a workspace context that I'm going to be able to provide this permission? So we saw that the workspace was the gathering space for a whole bunch of information. Maybe it's got virtual machines, it's got applications, it's got SQL information. That's in the workspace. Do I give you access to all of the information, the workspace context, or do I give it to it based on the resource? So I've collected the information in the workspace and I've got people who are the networking team. I only want them to see the networking traffic. I've got SQL data in there, or SQL information. I only want the SQL team to see that information so I can actually lock down or grant access to the information through a resource context within the pool of data that I have within the workspace itself. today I'm going to be talking specifically in context of Azure architecture and looking at the Azure workbooks and Azure Insights on the data that we have available to us. Let's get into this. We've talked in previous units about how do I take information, where do I get it from, and how do I bring it into a common location that I can actually then use that information. And that's where we're going to pick that story up. Azure Workbooks is a feature. They talk about a canvas, a space in which you can then hook it to a log analytics space that has data in it. And so now I want to be able to start taking that data and provide this rich analysis against that information. And so instead of having to create the queries every single time you look at the data, trying to build charts, I often talk that I'm a great plumber. I can pull all the data in. I can, build the repositories very well. I don't do very well with painting the room. I'm, building the reports. I'll get the data on the reports, but it's not going to look fancy. So you can have these great visualizations that are going to spin that information up so that you can make it available for people in a very digestible way. And then it's repeatable as a workbook that it says, here's this group of information. So maybe I've got the totality of my business rolling up into a log analytics workspace. There's a whole bunch of information I used in a previous example. In that workspace, maybe I've got networking information. Maybe I've got SQL information. Maybe I've got the app information itself. And so what I can do is create that segregation to say, here's the report on the networking features. I've been able to do the Kusto queries to pull that information up and present it in a manner that they want that information, or the networking people want it. I've got a different report that's going to show it to the SQL people. And then we can actually bring in some pre-configured insights, and you can customize them and add to them or deprecate the ones that we have, but you can apply these insights, which is some intelligence against that raw information, so that you can take analysis looking backwards, as well as some predictive patterns going forward. So taking a look at some of those tools that we have, we've got insights for applications. We've got insights for Azure Monitor VMs, for the VMs themselves, as well as for the containers. These are just some of the examples of the insights. So we mentioned in a previous module about virtual machines. A virtual machine running at a certain capacity, so you're taking a metric from Azure that shows that a VM is running at 90% CPU. Well, that's great. That's one metric. Well, if you grab the log information and the metric information from inside of the virtual machine, that 90% might be completely normal because the application is running properly. Or maybe it might be a bad thing because what's happened is you've got a memory leak in the application and it's run away and it's over consuming the resources. So you're going to be able to pull that information in, get some of this insights, this analytic information that you run against it that you could then report on. So these Azure Insights provide some of the analytical work that you can run against it. We've got some pre-configured ones that you can consume and then modify. The Application Insights component, so we've talked about some of the infrastructure pieces. The Application Insights is a separate account that you can set up. App Insights, as a service in Azure, allows you to generate a thing called a key, and it creates a storage space to store the specific information that you want about your application. So you would generate an Application Insights key and a storage space to store this information. Now, this could be in Azure. It could even be from on-premises if your application is running there. So you take this key, and there's some code that you can put into your application that says, here's the things that I want to take a look at. So I can track unique page hits. I want to know where those page hits came from. So geographic information. I want to know what kind of browsers came to my web page. So all of this deep information about the application. I want to know how long people spent on the page. I want to know how many times this button was clicked. All of that information is about the usage of the application. Now, there's three basic units of code that we can use, whether it's a server-side application, a console application, or a web-based application. You put those codes into those three different types of applications that you might deploy. You insert the insights key to say, take that telemetry information from whatever it is, a server-based application, a console application, or a web app, and emit that information into this insights account. So App Insights is an important part. I would strongly recommend that you use a common app insights across. You're seeing a multi-tiered application from a front end, middle tier, and back end. You want that information coming into a common app insights account. So it actually draws things like there's an application map that shows all the different interactions of the different components in your application design in a common pane of glass or a single pane of glass that you're working with. So App Insight's a great way to get overall telemetry information about your application usage. Today, I'm going to be talking about Azure architecture and specifically looking at the Azure Data Explorer. Let's get into it. We've talked about in other units how to collect the volumes of information that are going to be available to you. We've talked about some of the metrics and log information, but that's metric and log information. Overall, in other units, we've talked about a thing called your data estate. There's this large volume of data that exists across your environment. And what Azure Data Explorer provides for us is to be able to get this telemetry data, whether it be logs and metrics, usage information across the entire data estate that we're dealing with. You see on the slide, it talks about IoT devices. So, beyond some of the areas we've looked at before. And it allows you to take some of that log and telemetry information into a common area that through a graphical tool, you're going to be able to come in using Azure Data Explorer to be able to analyze and see this top-down picture of that landscape that you're working with. So it's a slightly different perspective to take a look at that overall perspective. And it's interesting, when you focus in so closely that you might not see what the problem is until you back out. And so they talk about, you can combine this with things like Azure Sentinel and Azure Monitor, other units that we've talked about, taking all of that information where Sentinel is going to be that gatekeeper, where Azure Monitor is looking at the technical information about the resources that are running, where you take a look at the data that might be being consumed. It gives me a slightly different perspective because if I'm taking a look at a monitor that some application is very heavily used, well, where's it getting heavily used? Oh, it's against a database that it's working with, and that would show up in this space here, showing you that that database is running hot across all of the databases that you might be working with. Okay, so we've looked at the estate. In the previous module, we talked about a data estate and how you manage it from your pure data. This is more your infrastructure data. Now we have a full data estate around that infrastructure information using Monitor, whether it be metrics or logs. We have that totality of information. Let's go and take a look at some of these tools in action and how they gather that information and some of the things that you might be able to do. And I'm going to call particular attention to that application insights account, because not only can you tell that an application is running on a server, but you're going to be able to get very specific metrics around the application itself. Because knowing that your server is running at 90% capacity is one thing, but is that a errant subservice running in Windows that's causing that utilization, or is it your application or a specific part of your application? So all of these layers, just the volume of information that we have, can really allow you to make some intelligent decisions around the use of your services and the performance that you're going to deliver to your customers. So let's go ahead and take a look at log analytics and monitoring within Azure. When it comes to monitoring, remember that everything in Azure is going to automatically be monitored, and by default, that information will be kept for 90 days. I'm at a resource group, and we can see that there's activity log, as well as a monitoring tab that we can take a look at on this blade. I'm going to jump into a specific resource, and you'll see that similar structure. So on every single object that we have inside of Azure, let me come into a virtual machine scale set. And again, I've got an activity log about the scale set itself. Now, if you take a look at the duration, this is a modified Custo query, the language that we use to query the activities in our logs and for metrics. And if I change the time to be more than the last 90 days, you'll see that that information is not going to be available. And this is why we have to export information into some storage location. We talked about a log analytics account. I'll be showing that one to you in just a minute. Moving down under monitoring, we still get things like alerts, metrics, and workbooks. We talked about the workbooks as those automated, repeated patterns of ways of looking at information that we can use to analyze and do performance evaluations against the resources that we're monitoring. I showed you that as we went to specific resources, whether it be a resource group or an actual resource, we saw that we had information at that level. We can also go into Monitor, where we now get access to a single pane of glass for all of the monitoring capabilities that we have. While we're on this subject, I want to mention Azure Advisor as a free tool that will be run against the current set of information that's available to Azure and make recommendations across the 5 major areas of cost, security, reliability, operational excellence, and performance. And what it's going to do is give you scores across all of these areas and make recommendations of things that you can do based around Microsoft recommended practices. I've popped outside of Azure Advisor and come back to a resource group or a specific resource if you wanted. And you can see that under the monitoring feature, that Azure Advisor recommendations are going to be here now as opposed to across the 5 major areas. You've got all of the areas that might apply to that specific object and the things that you can do to remediate based on those Microsoft recommended practices. So that's a brief overview of some of the built-in monitoring and tools that we have available for us inside of Azure. Looking at the Log Analytics workspace, you can create a workspace, and it's actually quite simple. It doesn't need a lot of information. It needs a subscription, a resource group that you would like it stored in, the name of the instance, and the region that it's going to be deployed to. And that's about it. But once you've created the workspace, then this is where you're going to be able to configure the storage of the different types of objects you're working with. Looking at the settings, you can see the types of information that we're ingesting into the Log Analytics workspace. Under the tables, you can see a variety of the tables and the type of information that's going to be in there, as well as you can create custom logs that will collect information for you. If you've seen the session that we did on the IaaS workloads of virtual machines, you saw that Azure Monitor has the information about the metrics and logs of the resources that are hosting your virtual machines. But if you wanted to be able to collect the log and metric information from within inside of the virtual machines, you needed to deploy agents to extract that information and export it to Azure Monitor. We now have that capability to bring that information into Log Analytics. Coming down under monitoring, this is where we're going to be able to see some of the alert information, the metrics. You'll see the Azure Advisor recommendations here again. And this is where we have our workbooks. Taking a look at the usage workbook, switching it to the last 90 days, we have an overview, a dashboard. We can have additional queries if we wanted to run them against this volume of data that we've ingested into this Log Analytics workspace. Let's return back to the lesson. Okay, welcome back from the demo. We saw that there's quite a bit in there and just briefly took a very high-level view of some of the things, the type of information that we have, how we can bring it into a Log Analytics workbook. We showed you some things with alerts and action groups that you have that can automate some of these processes. We showed you some of the ways that you can visualize this information. But really, this is kind of a job unto itself, but it's such a critical part that you want to make sure that, on a near real time, that you're monitoring the solutions so that you can get ahead of problems. And there's no reason to be able to have to, wait for someone to call you to let you know that there's a problem. You should be able to identify this and particularly get ahead of it, because if you can log the trends, that you can get ahead of a problem before it even exists. So this is such an important part around any type of deployment that you're working inside of Azure to make sure that it's, one, safe and it's operating professionally, as well as it's secure, because you can actually identify potential security breaches through some of misbehaved applications or people using them incorrectly, and you can get ahead of security issues by monitoring as well. So monitoring is such a huge part. Delve into this. It's got some great tools for you. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope to see you at the next lesson.